No rest for Donald Trump in August as the president sets up a summit with Vladimir Putin in Alaska for Friday of this week. Mr. Trump's goal is to make progress towards settling the long-running war in Ukraine, though the president of Ukraine so far, Volodymyr Zelensky, was not invited. Is Russia making any concessions here? And what is the outline of a possible deal that both sides could accept? Also, the president named Stephen Mirren, chairman of the White House Council of Economic Advisors, to fill a temporary spot on the Federal Reserve Board. What does that mean for the Fed and interest rates going forward?
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome. I'm Paul Gigot here on the Potomac Watch podcast, daily podcast, Wall Street Journal Opinion. I'm here today with Joe Sternberg and Julian Melcher, both of our London-based correspondents. Julian has made several trips to Ukraine since the war began in February of 2022, most recently just a few weeks ago. So Trump had a Friday deadline that he had given to Vladimir Putin about making progress towards a ceasefire. Trump let that pass and did not impose any sanctions. Instead, he announced, after a visit by his special envoy, Steve Witkoff, to Moscow, this summit on Friday in Alaska. And let's listen to Trump explain briefly today why he's going.
I'm going to meet with President Putin, and we're going to see what he has in mind. And if it's a fair deal, I'll reveal it to the European Union leaders and to the NATO leaders and also to President Zelensky. I think out of respect, I'll call him first, and then I'll call them after. And I may say, lots of luck, keep fighting.
All right, let's listen as well to J.D. Vance, the vice president, on Sunday on Fox News, explain what he thinks the president is going to do and what the possible outline of a settlement could be.
Vladimir Putin said that he would never sit down with Zelensky, the head of Ukraine, and the president has now got that to change. We're at a point now where we're now trying to figure out, frankly, scheduling and things like that around when these three leaders could sit down and discuss an end to this conflict. Now, what do I think is ultimately going to come out of this? Look, it's actually very simple. If you take where the current line of contact between Russia and Ukraine is, we're going to try to find some negotiated settlement that the Ukrainians and the Russians can live with, where they can live in relative peace, where the killing stops. It's not going to make anybody super happy. Both the Russians and the Ukrainians probably at the end of the day are going to be unhappy with it. But I don't think you can actually sit down and have this negotiation absent the leadership of Donald J. Trump.
All right. So Trump bringing them to the table. I will say this, Joe Biden made zero progress towards ending the war and really didn't have a plan for how he could negotiate a settlement. So Trump is getting Putin here to at least discuss this, Julian. But let's take the first here. What do you think of what Trump is trying to do?
Well, I fear that Putin is tapping him along, as he suggested at one point. I mean, you had this impending deadline, and suddenly Putin is ready to talk, but we're not real clear on the details of what he's ready to talk about, or whether that would actually bring us any closer to an end of the war. And I've been looking, and there have been discrepancies in the reports about the proposal that Putin has offered. But it sounds like what he's suggesting is in exchange for a ceasefire, Ukraine would withdraw from parts of Donetsk. And that's a really important region for the Ukrainians. They've spent since 2014 building up what they call fortress cities there. Now, these are strongholds that have prevented the Russians from rolling further west. So that's a real concession if Ukraine gives that up.
Just so our listeners understand, the Russians do not now control all of that region.
No, they don't. In fact, in their summer counteroffensive, they have not yet been able to make any tactically or operationally significant advances. Now, they are moving closer to taking Pokrovsk, which is one of the cities on that fortress belt that I was talking about. But that's been at just an enormous cost. The fight for that has been going on for more than a year. At one point, I was seeing the Russians were taking about 14,000 to 15,000 casualties a month to take that city. So it's pretty slow and grinding, even with the Russian advances in drone technology.
And just to try to clarify and summarize here, in return for the Ukrainians giving up all of Donetsk, that key region in the east of Ukraine, what would Putin, according to these mixed reports, give in return, other than the ceasefire?
We're not clear on that right now. It's not clear from the reporting whether Russia would make a corresponding withdrawal from territory that it controls in Zaporizhia, in Kherson, possibly Kharkiv or Sumy. What he's really saying is this is the price of a ceasefire. And you have to look back on Russia's history of ceasefires in Ukraine. Before the full-scale invasion, there were ceasefires negotiated under Minsk I and Minsk II. And Russia routinely violated those. So I think in Ukraine, there's a lot of skepticism that Russia will uphold a ceasefire now, uphold its commitments to a ceasefire now. And we're talking about real Ukrainian concessions that affect its defensibility of further territory in exchange for a ceasefire that would be tough to enforce with an actor that has not typically upheld its bargain on ceasefires. So I think there's some reason for skepticism about this deal.
Yeah, certainly that Minsk I and Minsk II are bad omens for Putin being able to accept any permanent ceasefire. But Volodymyr Zelensky said over the weekend, when these initial reports of, and there are conflicting reports, as Jillian says, about what it is that the land swap here that Putin is actually promising. Zelensky said, we can't allow concede any Russian territory, that any Russian ownership of Ukrainian territory, even the parts that it now occupies, like Crimea and big chunks of the east. But I guess, Joe, the question becomes, Ukraine has not been able to drive Russia out of those regions. So not being able to do that, and the killing grinds on and on, could it be the case that Ukraine has to settle for some kind of armistice line like this, even if in terms of de jure sense they don't acknowledge Russian control, Russian ownership of this? They just say, okay, for now we'll live with it.
They may have to make that kind of decision, but I think it's important to understand that they won't be making that decision in a vacuum. And so I think that one of the many moving pieces here that we need to not lose sight of as these negotiations continue, about some kind of agreement for a ceasefire or even an end to the war, is that a lot of this is contingent on the degree of support that Ukraine gets from the rest of the world, whether that's from the U.S., or from European allies who were embarrassingly dilatory about providing a lot of that support earlier in the war, and now find themselves in this position where not just the Ukrainians, but also the Europeans might have to accept concessions to Putin in Ukraine in terms of territory that are not necessarily in Europe's best interest. And I raise this point, not to relitigate these discussions that we've been having on this podcast for the entirety of the war at this point. But just to point out that, there is a lot more at stake in whatever negotiations are coming up than, just the issue of the Ukrainians and Russians. I think that Europe has a lot on the line, and the U.S. has a lot on the line in terms of our own security and the security of our European allies. And I think that it's important to understand as we shift into this negotiating phase that we are not passive participants in that process. And one of the ways that we could be more helpfully active participants would be giving Ukraine the support that they would need in order to exert pressure on Russia to negotiate a better deal for everyone.
On that point, let's listen to J.D. Vance talk about arming Ukraine, or funding the arms for Ukraine going forward.
What we said to the Europeans is simply, first of all, this is in your neck of the woods. This is in your back door. you guys have got to step up and take a bigger role in this thing. And if you care so much about this conflict, you should be willing to play a more direct and a more substantial way in funding this war yourself. I think the president, and I certainly think that America, we're done with the funding of the Ukraine war business. We want to bring about a peaceful settlement to this thing. We want to stop the killing. But Americans, I think, are sick of continuing to send their money, their tax dollars to this particular conflict. But if the Europeans want to step up and actually buy the weapons from American producers, we're okay with that, but we're not going to fund it ourselves anymore.
The contradiction there, Jillian, to me is we want to stop the killing, we want to end the war, but we are not going to help Ukraine with arms that will help it drive Putin to the bargaining table. We'll be happily to send the arms to have Europe buy them and supply them, but we're not going to fund them anymore. That's certainly going to be popular on the American MAGA movement, but it does limit the degree, depending on how many arms the Europeans can supply with their themselves or purchasing. It puts less pressure on Putin to settle. And of course, Trump has not so far. He pulled back from sanctions on the countries that buy oil from Russia, except for India. He didn't put any on Turkey. He didn't put any on China. So the question is, Putin seems to be feeling some more pressure to at least go to the table here than what he showed in the first 6 months of this administration. But I guess my question is, could he continue fighting if he doesn't get the terms he wants?
Yeah, Putin can definitely continue fighting. I mean, he's scaling up production of things like missiles, drones. I mean, I was looking, and the statistics here are really remarkable. Russia just last month launched 117 missiles, 6,145 various drones. It's doing these huge attacks where it really is scaling up and targeting cities. And I think you're going to see that trajectory increase. So you need to do something that puts pressure on Putin on that resource component, I think. And sanctions are one really good way to do it. You end up targeting his ability to finance the military, have him make tough choices between domestic expenditures that kind of support his regime and the military expenditures. So I'd favor that. But yeah, I think the Ukrainians absolutely need weapons. It doesn't really matter, I don't think, who pays for them. And it does seem like potential progress that the Trump administration is now open to providing them, even if it's with Europe buying them. So I guess I don't have that much of a problem with that policy. But I think that the Trump administration needs to be thinking about this in terms of how to put pressure on Putin, because otherwise there's no sign that his war machine is slowing down. It's ramping up.
All right. So on the optimistic side of this argument, Joe, Mark Rutte, the Secretary General of NATO, was on CBS this Sunday, and he said, well, look, the Trump has now gotten Putin to the table. That didn't happen before. Trump is going to go in there and test Putin. All right, Putin, what do you want? How serious are you about a peace or a ceasefire? And then what are the terms? And Rutte was actually fairly optimistic that this is going to be a useful step. But he also did say that some kind of land swap was probably going to be necessary, of the kind we were talking about before, was probably going to be necessary to get a ceasefire. And of course, maybe we all hope an armistice.
Yeah, I mean, these kind of negotiations I just find impossible to peg whenever Trump is involved. And we also have to point out that over the past few months, Vladimir Putin has demonstrated a remarkable capacity for irritating Trump at key moments. And so, we can't assume that just because these negotiations are going to happen, that they're going to end up going well for any of the participants. I think that there has been a discussion almost since the beginning that some sort of shift in the borders or land exchange might end up having to be part of the negotiated settlement. I think there are a couple points that we need to remember about that. First off, we always talk about this in terms of land transfers, but there are populations involved too. There are people living in a lot of these areas. And, I think that it creates a lot of very serious problems and dangers for many of those people if they end up on the wrong side of one of these borders after a land swap. And it's also worth pointing out, if you want to talk about this in cold, calculated, strategic security angle, Europe does not have a great experience over the past decades with this kind of population transfer or sort of shifting borders around and expecting people to lump it and just deal with whatever ends up. So I think that we need to be very careful about any deal that we end up about, are we storing up trouble for the future? Because of the way that an agreement has dealt with the concerns of the human beings who are going to be most directly affected by it.
Any deal, I think, Jillian, is going to have to deal with Ukraine's desire to have much better security guarantees. There's a debate over whether it will have the ability at some point to join NATO. That's a red line for Vladimir Putin. Probably Trump has already said, he has mostly already, I don't know if he's definitively said it can't be NATO, but he's come pretty close. But that doesn't mean you couldn't shore up Ukrainian defenses with massive arms influx. And you might be able even to have some European troops inside Ukraine as a way to deter Russia from future marauding across that eastern border, or perhaps up north, where they could try to move in through Belarus or the Russian border again. So that has to be a big part of this. And, I think the danger for Ukraine, of course, it's a smaller country. They've just put up a brilliant fight, a very brave fight. But boy, they're taking losses. I think that are significant. Zelensky just increased the draftable age, the military service age to, not quite as old as me, but getting up there. And it's putting enormous burden on Ukraine society. So I wonder if there is a way that Zelensky could sell a deal to the public in Ukraine that said, okay, we are going to have to concede right now. There's certain territorial losses we have to concede, but that's not in perpetuity. We're not conceding Crimea forever to Russia, but we are going to get out of this the ability to join the European Union, and we're going to get fortified borders.
I think that security guarantee is a really important question. So when you look at Ukrainian polling, people are a little bit more open to that sort of, we are not going to legally acknowledge Russia's claims on these lands, but we may have to accept that we give some of it up. And I think that's kind of the realist position. But in tension with that is, I've spoken to probably hundreds of Ukrainians over the past couple of years, and I have never met a single one who thinks that Vladimir Putin will stop after a ceasefire. And so we're talking about territorial concessions today for the land that he occupies. Tomorrow, it could be the land that you live on or your family members live on. And so I think that is kind of what's happening in the back of Ukrainians' heads as they think about this issue. Security guarantees are also going to be really important because if the war ends, if it's put on pause for now, martial law lifts. And so you've got like a lifting on the restrictions on men's ability to leave the country. And I think you might have men, if they don't feel confident that this war is not going to erupt again and that they're going to be back in the same situation, you might have people saying, well, this is my chance. I've stayed, I've fought, but I don't think the future looks bright, and leaving, which puts Ukraine in a less defensible position going forward. So the quality of those security guarantees really matters. Ukraine's made some very significant strides in its ability to arm itself. Its defense industry is really innovative. So I think there's a lot of opportunity for the West to go in and support that. I just think Ukrainians need the reassurance that if this war stops, that it's not going to erupt again, and that's going to be something that affects their ability to negotiate a peace.
Could not agree more with that. All right, let's leave it at that. We're going to have this big event on Friday. We'll see leading up to it. Trump said that he didn't think Zelensky would be at this meeting, but it will be at the next one, for what that is worth. This assumes, of course, that the negotiations would move forward from here. Joe, let's move for a little bit here to President Trump's appointment of Stephen Miran, head of the White House Council of Economic Advisors, to fill the temporary seat on the Fed Board of Governors that's been left by Adriana Kugler, who resigned on Friday. Miran would have to be confirmed by the Senate, but he could possibly get on the Fed Board of Governors by the September meeting in mid-September. And of course, I think would vote to cut interest rates. But the Fed is already moving, I think, to cut interest rates in September. But what do you make of this Miran appointment? What does it say about what Trump wants on the Federal Reserve?
Well, I think Trump has always wanted people who will agree with his view of the economy at the Fed. And in fact, one of his frustrations with current Chairman Jerome Powell is that that's the kind of person that Trump thought that he was getting when he nominated Powell to that role in the first term, and then felt kind of disappointed. So I think that he has been looking for people that he could put at the Fed who will accommodate his desire for lower interest rates, which I think is a priority, partly because Trump does seem to be worried about the strain on the federal budget of accommodating debt interest. And then also use lower interest rates in an attempt to spur on economic growth, which is always something that's a priority for a president. And I think that from that perspective, Stephen Miran has given a lot of evidence that he would probably be accommodating of Trump's views. I think that from what we can tell of his public record, he would probably agree with Trump that a weaker dollar is desirable as a boost to exports and a way to rebalance global trading relationships.
Strike the probably there, Joe. He definitely believes that.
It definitely believes that. I think that he would be another vote supporting lower interest rates. Now, I don't think that he would be a decisive vote because remember, in the Federal Open Market Committee, each of the 7 members of the Board of Governors get a vote, and then a rotating cast of characters from the presidents of the regional reserve banks around the country. But I think that this would definitely be an attempt by Trump to inject more voices into those councils in favor of lower interest rates that Trump seems desperately to want at the moment.
The fascinating thing to me here is that Stephen Miran has done a lot of writing critical of the dollar, the U.S. dollar standing as the world's reserve currency. What that means is that central banks hold U.S. dollars in reserve. It means most of the world's goods, services are traded in dollars, and that means there's a global demand for dollars. Miran thinks that is bad. He calls it an exorbitant burden, whereas often it is referred to as an exorbitant privilege by some of the world other countries because they don't like the fact that they have to trade in dollars. It also gives the reserve currency. This is a subject for a longer discussion than today, but it's fascinating that Miran really does think that the U.S. should give up over time its reserve currency status, which, even though Trump wants a lower dollar, he likes the reserve currency.
Yeah, I mean, there is a serious intellectual theory here. It's not always clear to me how much Trump himself actually believes it. But I think the kernel of this is this notion that because the dollar is the global reserve currency, the rest of the world has an enormous appetite for dollar-denominated assets like treasuries, treasury bonds, and that forces the U.S. to run trade deficits and fiscal deficits, and misery ensues as a result of that. And what's noticeable about this theory is how little agency it assigns to us in the U.S. I think that you're putting people in senior positions of economic policymaking in the U.S., including now apparently the Federal Reserve Board of Governors, who think that the U.S. is not the author of its own economic fate, that we are exclusively consigned to accepting policy decisions that are made in Beijing or Berlin about their demand for dollar assets, and then we just have to lump it unless we want to do something like tariffs to punish the rest of the world. That is just an odd way of viewing the world. I mean, if we had longer, we could talk about all of the data evidence over the decades that suggests that this is not actually how the world works. And it's also strange that an administration that is bills itself as being about making America great again is adopting all of these economic policies that are built around the idea of, billing America as a victim of the rest of the world.
Yeah, it's fascinating debate that we could have, and I think one of the interesting questions would be, all right, so Trump has appointed Mirren here to fill this temporary post. One of the things it does is it buys him time to make a permanent replacement at the Fed for Kugler. Could be Mirren, or what if Trump decides, okay, I'll make Mirren. This is a test run here for Mirren in this temporary position as a governor for whether or not I could make him chair. And as a chairman of the Federal Reserve, he would have a global podium platform from which to talk about his ideas, and could very well implement a monetary policy that did weaken the dollar. And that is a pretty risky policy if you're going to pursue that as chairman of the central bank, Joe.
Yeah, and one of the things that is so disappointing about the situation is what a huge missed opportunity it is for Trump, because we need desperately to have a big debate in Congress and more broadly about how the Fed operates, the way it thinks about its policy role in the economy, the decisions it makes. I mean, remember, only a couple of years ago, they made their most serious policy error in 40 years when they allowed the inflation of the Biden era to start running out of control and then had to struggle from the back foot to dial it back in. So we need a discussion about exactly what went wrong there. Why did they miss that inflation when it was developing? What have they learned from that experience? And in his first term, Trump did seem to be willing to engage with some of those debates. I mean, we had an attempt to nominate the economist Judy Shelton to a position on the Fed Board of Governors at one point, and she encountered pretty fierce resistance from the economics establishment and the financial press. But I mean, if you look at her track record, there was a lot of serious thinking there about the global economy, the dollar's role in the global economy, and how the Fed should actually be thinking about the dollar and the role the Fed plays in the U.S. economy. And with this Steve Mirren appointment, it seems that is not the debate that we are setting up. And yet it would have been a great opportunity for Trump to actually ask some of those questions.
Well, there's still a chance he nominates somebody who would address some of those questions for the Federal Reserve chair. We shall see. Thank you, Jillian. Thanks, Joe. Thank you all for listening. We're here every day on Potomac Watch, and we hope you'll join us tomorrow.